In the remote village of Ravelstone, a dense fog always rolled in from the moor at nightfall, thickening around the abandoned chapel that stood on the hill. Locals spoke of strange sounds, whispers carried by the wind, and shadowy figures glimpsed through the mist. No one dared go near after sunset, for it was said the fog was cursed, haunted by spirits long forgotten. Among the villagers, young Clara was the only one brave, or foolish, enough to venture close to the chapel. Her father had disappeared there years ago, leaving only a trail of footsteps that vanished at the chapel's door. Determined to discover what had happened to him, Clara ventured up the hill one evening, the fog already swirling around her feet like ghostly fingers. As she reached the chapel, the temperature dropped sharply, her breath misting in the air. The door creaked open on its own, inviting her in. Inside, the chapel was in ruins, yet it felt alive. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the faint scent of damp earth and something more decayed filled the air. Clara heard it then, the whispering, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur, like voices speaking from a great distance. She turned toward the altar, and there, in the dim light, she saw a figure. At first, it seemed human, but as Clara drew nearer, the figure's skin appeared translucent, its eyes hollow, its mouth moving but making no sound. "Father," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, acknowledging her, but something was wrong. This wasn't her father. The air around her grew thick with whispers, and the fog began to seep into the chapel, swirling around the figure and Clara both. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Clara felt a pressure in her mind, like hands gripping her skull. Panicked, she tried to back away, but the fog coiled around her legs, tightening, holding her in place. From the shadows, more figures emerged, dozens of them, their faces twisted, some contorted in silent screams. They reached out to her, their cold fingers brushing her skin. Clara's heart raced as she realized they weren't just spirits, they were trapped, bound to the fog, feeding it, growing stronger. A deep, rumbling voice echoed through the chapel, drowning out the whispers. "Once you enter the fog, you never leave." Clara's eyes widened in terror as she turned to flee, but the fog had closed in around her, thick and suffocating. She felt it creeping into her lungs, filling her with cold dread. The figures were all around her now, their mouths moving as if chanting in some ancient, forgotten tongue. Clara tried to scream, but no sound came out. In the distance, the village lights flickered as the fog rolled further down the hill, spreading out, reaching for more. And in the chapel, the whispers never stopped. Weeks passed, and Clara never returned. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, avoiding the hill as the fog grew thicker with each night. Some said they could still hear her voice, faint and desperate, calling out from within the mist. Others claimed to see her shadow, forever walking the path to the chapel, searching for something that could never be found. The fog became part of the village, a constant, chilling reminder of those lost. But something darker stirred within it, something that was growing. The whispers were no longer just distant voices, they were promises of more to come, of others to join them in their endless, haunted fog. And the village could feel it. Ravelstone would not be safe for much longer. The fog was hungry. The fog thickened with each passing night, creeping ever closer to the village. The elders warned the villagers to stay indoors after dark, but even during the day, the air felt colder, the sky darker, as if the fog was swallowing the very light itself. People spoke less, their eyes drawn to the hill where the chapel stood, a distant silhouette in the mist. Yet, the whispers grew louder. One evening, a group of villagers gathered at the tavern, exchanging nervous glances. Among them was Alden, Clara's childhood friend, who had watched helplessly as she disappeared. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still alive, trapped somewhere within that fog. Every night, her voice seemed to call to him, soft and pleading. "We need to do something," Alden said, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. "We can't just let it keep spreading." The others murmured in agreement, but their faces were pale with fear. "And what do you suggest?" asked Mary, the baker's wife. "Go up there. End up like Clara, like your father." Alden clenched his fists. "We can't keep hiding. If we do nothing, it'll take all of us." There was a long pause, but then another voice spoke up, low and gravelly. It was old Elias, the village blacksmith, and the oldest man in Ravelstone. The fog ain't natural, he muttered. Something's in it. Something older than the village, older than the chapel. It was waiting, and now it's waking. Everyone turned to Elias, their eyes wide. His words carried the weight of truth, and it chilled them to the bone. Do you know what it is? Alden asked. Elias's eyes flickered toward the chapel, barely visible through the tavern window. They say there were rituals, dark ones, before the chapel, before Ravelstone was even here. The fog isn't just a curse, it's a prison. Alden swallowed hard. For what? Elias lowered his voice, his face grim. Not for asterisk, what asterisk? For asterisk, who asterisk? The spirits trapped in the fog. They're the jailers, keeping something much worse inside. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. So, if Clara is up there, Mary began, her voice trembling. She's not alone, Elias finished. And whatever's in there wants out. A heavy silence followed. Alden's resolve hardened. Then we need to free her. And stop whatever this is. Elias shook his head. It's not that simple. The fog. It's alive. Once it has you, it changes you. Clara's already part of it. No, Alden said firmly. I don't believe that. Before anyone could stop him, Alden stood and stormed out of the tavern, grabbing a lantern as he went. The villagers watched as his silhouette vanished into the night, swallowed by the fog. As Alden approached the chapel, the whispers grew deafening. His lantern flickered, casting erratic shadows across the mist. He could feel the fog wrapping around him, cold and wet, tugging at his clothes, as if it had a mind of its own. Clara, he shouted into the gloom. Clara, I'm here. I'm going to find you. A faint voice responded, barely audible over the wind. Alden. His heart skipped a beat. It was her. He rushed toward the sound, his lantern swinging wildly. The fog thickened, and he could barely see a few feet ahead. The chapel loomed before him, its door hanging open like a black moth. Without hesitation, Alden stepped inside. The air was colder here, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The fog swirled at his feet, thicker than ever, and the whispers surrounded him. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, figures that weren't quite human, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Alden. Her voice was closer now, coming from deeper within the chapel. He followed it, his breath quickening as the temperature dropped further. The whispers turned into a chorus of voices, each one begging, pleading, demanding. His lantern flickered again, the flame barely holding on. Clara, where are you? He called out. Suddenly, the fog parted, and there she was standing before the altar, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. But something was wrong. Her skin was too pale, her movements too slow. And behind her, looming in the fog, was a figure taller, darker, more menacing. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Alden, you shouldn't have come, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Before Alden could respond, the figure stepped forward, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. She flinched, but didn't move away. What is that? Alden asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. You came to free her, it said, its voice a low growl that echoed through the chapel. But she is already mine, as you will be. The fog closed in around them, tighter, colder. Alden felt it pressing against his skin, seeping into his mind. The whispers became screams, and the shadowy figures in the fog moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Alden stepped forward, determined to pull her away from the creature, but the fog held him back. The creature laughed, a deep, hollow sound that made the very walls tremble. Soon, it whispered, soon, all of Ravelstone will join us. The fog swirled faster, the air thick with tension. Alden struggled to keep his grip on the lantern, but it was growing dimmer, the light fading. And then, just as the fog threatened to swallow him whole, he heard a voice, faint, distant, but familiar. Alden, run. It was Clara's voice, her real voice. Without thinking, he turned and fled, stumbling through the fog, the whispers chasing him as he ran. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the village, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The fog lingered at the edge of the hill, watching, waiting. Alden knew now that Clara was still in there. But she wasn't alone, and whatever had claimed her wasn't done with him yet. Alden's mind raced as he sat on the edge of the village, the fog looming behind him like a living, breathing thing. He could still hear the whispers, faint but ever present, pulling at his thoughts, urging him to return. Clara was in there, trapped in a nightmare far worse than death. But deep down, he knew, she wasn't truly Clara anymore. The village was quiet when he stumbled back to the tavern. The fire had died, and the villagers were gone. Windows shut tight, doors barred. Only old Elias sat by the cold hearth, his eyes hollow and distant. "They know you went up there," Elias muttered, barely looking at Alden. "And now, they know you'll bring it back." Alden shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "I have to save her," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't just leave her there." Elias sighed, his hands trembling as he clutched his mug. "She's already gone, lad. She's part of it now." Alden turned away, his mind refusing to accept it. Clara was still in there, buried beneath the whispers, the fog, the malevolent presence. If there was even a chance to pull her free, he had to take it. That night, Alden returned to the hill. The fog was waiting for him, thick and impenetrable, swirling in unnatural patterns as if aware of his presence. The lantern in his hand flickered weakly, its flame barely cutting through the dense mist. But Alden pressed on, determined to reach the chapel one last time. As he approached, the fog seemed to part for him, revealing the shadowed silhouette of the chapel. The door was wide open, as though beckoning him inside. His breath hitched in his throat, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Inside, the air was colder than before, and the shadows moved restlessly along the walls. The figures, those twisted, hollow-eyed spirits, watched him from every corner, their faces twisted in agony. Alden's lantern barely illuminated the space, casting only the faintest glow. At the altar, Clara stood, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes distant. But she was no longer alone. The dark figure loomed behind her, its presence dominating the room, its glowing green eyes fixed on Alden with malevolent amusement. "You came back," the figure growled, its voice low and mocking. "Foolish boy." Alden's hands trembled as he took a step forward. "Clara, I'm here. I'm going to take you away from this." Clara didn't move. Her eyes flickered with something, pain, sorrow, or perhaps regret, but her lips remained sealed, her body rigid. The fog thickened around her, wrapping her in its cold embrace. "She can't leave," the creature said, stepping closer. "She belongs to me now." "As do you." Alden raised the lantern, desperate, defiant. "Let her go." The creature laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the ruined chapel. "You still don't understand, do you? The fog takes what it wants, and no one escapes." Before Alden could react, the fog surged toward him, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. The lantern fell from his grasp, its light snuffed out instantly. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing his limbs, choking the breath from his lungs. Clara took a step forward, her face twisted in anguish. "Alden, you shouldn't have come back." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through him like a knife. He reached out to her, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, but the fog tightened around him, pulling him back. The dark figure loomed over him now, its smile wide, its eyes glowing brighter. "Now you'll join us." Alden's vision blurred as the fog consumed him, his body growing colder, heavier. The whispers filled his ears, no longer distant but right inside his mind, filling every corner of his thoughts. He struggled to stay conscious, to fight the creeping darkness, but it was no use. Clara's voice was the last thing he heard, faint and sorrowful, echoing through the fog. "I'm sorry, Alden." When the villagers awoke the next morning, the fog had spread further down the hill, curling at the edges of the village like the fingers of a great beast. No one ventured outside. The tavern remained empty, the streets silent. Old Elias, sitting by his window, stared into the mist. He knew what had happened. Alden had been claimed, just like Clara, just like the others. Soon, the fog would come for them all. That night, the whispers came again, louder now, more insistent. The fog pressed against the doors and windows of every home, creeping under the cracks, seeping into the very air they breathed. By morning, Ravelstone was gone, swallowed by the fog. And the whispers, they never stopped. The end.